Just minutes ago, the most powerful institution in the Western world slammed its doors shut on the most powerful woman in Europe, Ursula von der Leyen, the woman who controls the economic fate of 450 million people, the woman who has lectured presidents and threatened billionaires. The woman who calls herself the shield of European democracy was just flatly, publicly, and humiliatingly rejected by Donald Trump. No meeting, no phone call, no courtesy, nothing. While she was left waiting, Italy's Giorgia Meloni was sitting inside the White House, laughing over dinner with the most powerful man on the planet. And that contrast, that single brutal contrast, has just changed everything about the future of Europe and America. This is not a scheduling conflict. This is not a miscommunication. This is a deliberate, calculated, surgical strike against Brussels. And today, we are going to tell you exactly why Trump did it, exactly what it means, and exactly why the consequences are going to be far worse than anyone in the mainstream media is telling you. To understand why this rejection is so catastrophic, you first need to understand who Ursula von der Leyen actually is. Not the polished version she presents to cameras, but the real story of how she climbed to the top of European power and why that very climb has made her one of the most controversial and mistrusted figures in transatlantic politics today. Ursula von der Leyen did not rise to the presidency of the European Commission through a popular vote. European citizens never elected her. She was installed in 2019 through a closed-door deal between EU member states, a backroom negotiation that even members of the European Parliament described at the time as a democratic scandal. She scraped through her confirmation vote by just 9 votes, 9 out of 751 members. That is how thin her mandate was. That is how many people, even within the European establishment, had doubts about handing her the keys to the most powerful bureaucratic machine in the world. And yet, despite that razor-thin approval, she consolidated power at a speed that shocked even seasoned Brussels insiders. Within months of taking office, von der Leyen had transformed the European Commission from a relatively technocratic institution into a highly centralized power center with herself at its core. She bypassed traditional commission structures, sidelining commissioners who pushed back against her agenda and rewarding loyalists with expanded portfolios. She centralized communications, centralized decision-making, and turned the Commission presidency into something that looked far less like a civil servant's role and far more like an executive presidency, a role that, crucially, no European treaty had ever actually authorized her to hold. Then came COVID-19, and with it, the scandal that would follow Ursula von der Leyen like a shadow all the way to Washington. In the frantic early months of the pandemic, von der Leyen personally took control of the EU's vaccine procurement strategy. She bypassed the normal commission procurement processes. She negotiated directly with pharmaceutical executives, and most controversially, she exchanged a series of text messages with Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla that resulted in a contract worth nearly 1.8 billion doses, one of the largest pharmaceutical procurement deals in human history. When the European Parliament demanded to see those text messages as part of a transparency investigation, von der Leyen's office claimed they had simply been deleted, gone, vanished, from a sitting EU president's phone during an active parliamentary inquiry. The New York Times filed a legal complaint to access those messages. The European Ombudsman ruled that the Commission had engaged in maladministration, and von der Leyen faced no consequences whatsoever. She was reappointed to a second term in 2024, again without a direct popular mandate, again through elite negotiation behind closed doors. This is the woman Donald Trump just refused to meet. And here is the critical thing that the mainstream media is completely missing in its coverage of this snub. Trump is not the only one who has been watching that vaccine scandal. Viktor Orban has been talking about it for years. Giorgia Meloni has referenced it repeatedly. A growing bloc of European leaders, particularly those on the nationalist and conservative right, have been building a quiet but increasingly open case that von der Leyen represents exactly the kind of unaccountable, self-dealing elite bureaucratic power that is destroying faith in Western institutions. Trump doesn't just agree with that assessment, he has made dismantling that kind of power the central organizing principle of his entire political career. So when Trump looked at the guest list for his Washington meetings and made the decision to welcome Meloni but freeze out von der Leyen, he was not making a scheduling decision. He was making a political declaration. He was publicly, visibly, and deliberately drawing a line between the Europe he is willing to engage with and the Europe he has decided to treat as an adversary. Meloni's Italy sits on one side of that line, nationalist, sovereignty-focused, skeptical of Brussels' overreach. Von der Leyen's European Commission sits on the other, supranational, regulatory, and, in Trump's framing, the living embodiment of the globalist bureaucracy he has spent a decade running against. But the rejection goes even deeper than ideology, because in the weeks leading up to this snub, von der Leyen had been doing something that people in Trump's inner circle viewed not just as politically misaligned, but as a direct provocation. She had been making the rounds in European capitals, building what she was openly calling a coalition of the willing, a bloc of European nations prepared to deepen defense cooperation, expand military spending, and position Europe as a strategic actor independent of American leadership. She gave speeches in Warsaw, in Paris, in Berlin, framing European strategic autonomy not as a distant ambition, but as an urgent necessity in the age of Trump. She publicly floated the idea of European nuclear deterrence. She called for a new era of European sovereignty. And she did all of this loudly, publicly, and in direct response to signals coming out of Washington. Inside the White House, that was not read as European confidence. It was read as a declaration of competitive intent. Sources close to the administration described von der Leyen's autonomy push as Brussels trying to build a rival power structure to challenge American strategic dominance. And that assessment, whether you agree with it or not, fundamentally shaped how Trump's team decided to treat her visit request. They didn't just decline the meeting, they made sure the world knew they declined it. They made sure the contrast with Meloni was visible. They turned the rejection itself into a message. And that message has landed in Brussels like a bomb, because what Trump has just done is something no American president has done in the post-war era. He has formally, publicly, and deliberately elevated a member state leader above the head of the European Union's executive body. He has told the world that he does not recognize von der Leyen's commission as a legitimate or preferred face of Europe. He has told every EU member state government watching that if they want access to Washington, Brussels is not the door they need to knock on. The question now is whether von der Leyen has any real power left to fight back, or whether Trump has just exposed something that the Brussels establishment has been desperately trying to hide for years. Because the cracks inside the European Union right now are not small. They are not manageable. And what Trump just did may have made them completely impossible to paper over. The cracks inside the European Union did not appear overnight. They have been forming for years, hidden beneath the surface of carefully staged summits and choreographed unity statements, buried under the institutional language that Brussels uses to project strength it increasingly does not possess. But Trump's rejection of von der Leyen has done something that years of internal EU disagreement could not do on its own. It has given every dissident voice inside the bloc a moment, a symbol, and a weapon. Start with Giorgia Meloni, because her role in the story is far more calculated than the press is admitting. When Meloni flew to Washington and sat down to dinner with Trump while von der Leyen's meeting request was sitting unanswered in the White House inbox, that was not a coincidence of scheduling. Meloni has been playing a strategic double game for months, maintaining her formal membership in EU structures while quietly building a separate bilateral relationship with the Trump administration that effectively bypasses Brussels entirely. She has positioned herself as a translator between Washington and Europe, the only leader on the continent that Trump's team trusts, the woman who can pick up the phone and get through when von der Leyen cannot even get a meeting. That positioning is not accidental. It is the result of a deliberate long-term strategy to make herself indispensable to both sides while von der Leyen's influence erodes on both fronts simultaneously. And Meloni is not operating alone. Behind her stands a network of European nationalist leaders who have spent years arguing that the European Commission under von der Leyen has overstepped its mandate, weaponized regulation against member state sovereignty, and driven the continent toward economic decline through ideological obsession with the Green Deal and digital censorship frameworks that have strangled innovation and punished business. Viktor Orban of Hungary has been making this argument the loudest and the longest. He has called von der Leyen's commission autocratic. He has blocked EU decisions, refused EU funding conditions, and traveled to Washington, Moscow, and Beijing on his own diplomatic missions that Brussels had no knowledge of and no control over. Orban has been treated as a pariah inside the EU for this behavior, but after Trump's snub of von der Leyen, Orban does not look like a pariah anymore. He looks like a prophet. Then there is the German dimension, and this is where the story gets truly explosive. Germany has historically been the anchor of the European Union, the largest economy, the biggest net contributor to the EU budget, the country whose political weight kept the entire Brussels project stable, even when it was lurching through crisis after crisis. But Germany today is not the Germany of Angela Merkel. It is a country that has just emerged from one of the most destabilizing political periods in its post-war history, with a collapsed coalition government, a surging far-right AfD party that is now polling as the single most popular party in the country, and a new conservative chancellor in Friedrich Merz, who has already signaled that his relationship with Brussels will be fundamentally different from his predecessors. Merz is not an Orban. He is not going to blow up the EU from the inside, but he is also not going to subordinate German national interest to Commission directives the way Merkel's governments often did. He has made that clear in his early statements on migration, on defense spending, and on the EU's relationship with the United States. And a Germany that is even slightly less deferential to Brussels is a Germany that massively weakens von der Leyen's ability to project authority at a moment when that authority is already under direct attack from Washington. Layered on top of all of this is the economic reality that von der Leyen's commission has been running from for 2 years but can no longer hide. Europe's industrial base is in serious trouble. Germany's manufacturing sector, the engine that powered European prosperity for decades, contracted sharply in 2024 and has shown no meaningful signs of recovery. Energy costs across the continent remain dramatically higher than in the United States, a direct consequence of the post-Ukraine war restructuring of European energy supply that von der Leyen's commission managed with spectacular incompetence. The Green Deal, which von der Leyen made the signature project of her first term, has become a politically toxic brand across large parts of the continent, blamed by farmers, by manufacturers, by small business owners, and by working-class voters for driving up costs, destroying jobs, and imposing regulatory burdens that competitors in Asia and America simply do not face. Von der Leyen has tried to rebrand, to soften the edges, to talk about competitiveness alongside sustainability. But the damage to her credibility on economic management is deep, and it matters enormously right now, because the next battle she faces is not just diplomatic, it is financial. Because Trump's rejection is not simply a personal insult, it is the opening move in what is shaping up to be the most serious transatlantic trade confrontation since the Second World War. Trump has already signaled sweeping tariffs on European goods. His administration has made clear that it views the EU's trade surplus with the United States as an unacceptable imbalance that must be corrected by force if necessary. And von der Leyen, the woman who is supposed to be Europe's chief trade negotiator, the woman who is supposed to have the relationships, the leverage, and the credibility to sit across the table from Washington and defend European economic interests, has just been told she cannot even get in the building. The symbolic damage of that is enormous, but the practical damage is worse, because every day that von der Leyen cannot establish direct communication with the Trump White House is a day that European businesses, European workers, and European governments are exposed to escalating American economic pressure with no one capable of negotiating a way out. The question hanging over Brussels tonight is brutal and simple. If the president of the European Commission cannot get a meeting with the president of the United States, what exactly is the European Commission for? The answer to that question is already taking shape, and it is far more alarming for Brussels than anything that has happened so far, because what Trump is building is not simply a preference for certain European leaders over others. What he is constructing, methodically and deliberately, is an entirely parallel architecture of transatlantic relationships that completely circumvents the European Commission and renders von der Leyen's institution functionally irrelevant to the most important geopolitical decisions of the next decade. Meloni is the centerpiece of that architecture, but she is not alone. Poland's Donald Tusk has been quietly cultivating Washington ties of his own, using Poland's frontline NATO position and its massive American military presence to build bilateral leverage that does not flow through Brussels. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have been doing the same, framing their security relationships with Washington in purely bilateral terms that bypass EU defense structures entirely. Even France's Emmanuel Macron, who has spent years positioning himself as Europe's sovereign voice, has been forced to seek direct bilateral engagement with Trump's team because he understands that waiting for von der Leyen to broker access is now a losing strategy. The architecture of European dependence on American power is being rewired leader by leader, capital by capital, and Brussels is being cut out of every single conversation. What this means for von der Leyen personally is devastating. She built her entire second-term mandate around the idea that Europe needed to speak with one voice in the age of Trump, and that voice would be hers. She staked her legacy on being the person who could hold the European project together under external pressure, who could negotiate from strength with Washington, who could translate European unity into geopolitical leverage. That strategy has now collapsed completely. She cannot speak for Europe because Europe's most important leaders are no longer waiting for her to speak. They are already talking directly to Washington without her. She cannot negotiate trade terms because Trump will not take her call. She cannot project strength because the snub has been so public, so visible, and so deliberately humiliating that every government inside the EU is now quietly recalculating whether alignment with von der Leyen is an asset or a liability. Inside Brussels, the whispers that were quiet 3 weeks ago are now loud. There are serious conversations happening at senior levels about whether the Commission can function effectively through the remainder of her term with this level of diplomatic isolation from Washington. There are member state governments privately asking whether a different Commission leadership configuration, one that Trump might actually engage with, needs to be engineered before the trade war escalates beyond the point of no return. Von der Leyen has survived scandals before. She has survived the vaccine text message scandal, survived narrow confirmation votes, survived open hostility from Orban and his allies. But she has never before faced a situation where the President of the United States has made her personal exclusion a visible and deliberate element of his European strategy. The Iron Lady of Brussels has just discovered that the most powerful office in the world doesn't just ignore you. Sometimes it erases you. And the terrifying question that nobody in the mainstream media is asking yet is whether Donald Trump has already made a private promise to one of her rivals that her time is almost up.